Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Rio Tazwell with People for the American Way. I'm joined with Liz Kennedy at Center for American Progress and Rachel Curley at Public Citizen. We are coming to you live here at the United States Senate on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., talking about a very important issue that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the issue of money in politics, and in particular, a bill that can help address this systemic problem. We're here to talk to Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Cicilline today about some legislation that they're supporting to increase disclosure of political spending. So, Liz, why is money in politics a big problem? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of reasons that it's a problem, but what's a quick summary of why people should be concerned about the influence of money in politics?
Sure. Americans deserve fair representation from their elected government, and unfortunately, the massive amounts of big money from corporate and wealthy special interests really distort the kind of policies that our government ends up adopting. And it really silences the voices of Americans who want government to be working in their interests, but who don't have the kind of dollars necessarily to have the kind of access and influence that wealthy special interests are able to buy. And unfortunately, when money is secret, when there is dark money coming in, $900 million of dark money in our politics since the Citizens United decision, then it takes away even more tools from Americans who need transparency to demand accountability for their elected representatives.
Absolutely. Secret political spending is such a huge problem. And Rachel, we're here to talk about the DISCLOSE Act today with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Congressman Cicilline, both from Rhode Island. Could you tell us a little bit about what this bill does before we go and talk to the members?
Yeah, absolutely. So this bill, as Liz was alluding to, gets at the secret money that comes into our elections. So as Liz was talking about, there's a lot of money that comes in, but a huge chunk of it is secret. And the problem with that is if, folks at home see a campaign ad and they don't know who's funding it, they don't know whether or not to trust that message. It could be, an ad that says you should not vote for drug prices in Ohio for making them more affordable. And that could actually be funded by pharmaceutical companies. And we would have no idea. So this new legislation, the DISCLOSE Act that's being introduced today, helps bring transparency to those big dollars that are coming in secretly into our elections. And one more thing that I know we'll get into with the members is that this also will help stop foreign influence from entering secretly into our elections. And I know folks have been paying attention to the Russia election meddling, and so it's really a key issue right now and something that I'm sure we'll talk about more when we go speak with the members.
Absolutely. Very topical interest. I'm sure we'll get more into it as we debrief back out in the hallway, but for now we're going to go ahead and start the conversation with the senator and the member who have been so kind to take time out of their very busy schedules to meet with us today. As you can see, we're walking into Sheldon Whitehouse's, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's Capitol Hill office here in the Hart Building on Capitol Hill. Got a very active staff working. Another busy day in Washington. Always so much stuff happening, and we're very appreciative of the members and their dedicated staff for taking the time out of their schedules to meet with us today, and appreciate everyone watching at home. Be sure to comment, like, and share. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to meet with us today.
How are you?
Hi, Rio Tazwell, nice to see you.
Rio, good to see you. Welcome.
Always.
Thank you so much,
Nice
Senator.
to see you, Liz. How are you?
Very well.
Rachel, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you.
Great.
So grab a seat.
Yeah, let's do
Thank you
this.
so much.
Let's talk transparency. Very much appreciate you all taking the time to meet with us today. So, Senator Whitehouse, you are reintroducing the DISCLOSE Act today. For the folks watching at home, could you please give us a little bit of context about why disclosure is important in our political system and what, in particular, this bill will do to help further that?
Sure. David and I are doing this bill in the Senate and the House respectively because 8 out of 10 Americans are losing faith in the American democratic system. It's always been our jewel. It's been the thing we held up to the world as a city on a hill. It's, our democracy is our proudest export. And now even Americans are losing confidence in it. And they're losing confidence in it for a very simple reason, which is that it's actually not answering them any longer. It is answering special interests. And everybody knows that in their gut, but you can also go to academic studies that prove it on a peer-reviewed scientific basis, if you can imagine that. So what's the problem? Why is this happening? It's happening because of the amount of special interest money that has poured into politics and poured into Washington. And worse than the unlimited special interest money, they figured out how to hide it. They figured out how to hide who they are. So now the public never gets the full storyline, never learn about the motive. Because instead of it being ExxonMobil or some other big special interest, it's like Iowans for peace and puppies and prosperity, and nobody knows who that is, but everybody knows that smells bogus, and the whole thing is creepy. And then once you can do the unlimited money and the dark money, you can then add this whole other smelly corner of the problem, which is threats. Private threats and promises that we will or will not drop unlimited dark money in on your head as a candidate if you don't behave. So clearing out the dark money and letting some sunlight in is, to me, the most important thing we can do to restore our democracy. We're not hassling the little people with all this. You don't get affected by this until you've spent $10,000. And I think in our country, if you've come and you've spent more than $10,000, you probably have a motive, and it's important that the American public know what your motive is. And my belief is that when we put the spotlight on this, it'll be like turning on the lights and the cockroaches all scuttle for the shadows. There'll be a lot less mischief once the lights are on. So that's what we're up to.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yes.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as Republicans used to believe,
Right.
used to clamor for.
And I think it's also, people fundamentally understand that Washington is not working for them. They don't always understand why, but it's the influence of dark money, being put forth by special interests, where the agenda of these special interest groups is really coming to the forefront in terms of the agenda here in Washington. And people, they understand that the system isn't working, not working for them. And what this bill will help them understand is who it's working for, where the money's coming from, who's contributing. So why do we pay higher prices for prescription drugs? Because of the influence of big pharma's money in Washington. Why do we still give billions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuel companies? Big dark secret money. And so I think this will be a way to help make sure that our government actually works for the benefit of the many rather than for the benefit of the few powerful special interests that currently secretly manipulate and contribute to our elections.
And unfortunately, this past cycle, we really became aware of how secret political spending is a national security threat. We've been seeing that these dark money avenues, we see active attempts at foreign interference in our democracy.
Yep.
And so clearly this is also something that needs to be addressed, really to close these dark money loopholes to prevent this kind of foreign interference. And I wonder if both of you could explain to our audience how this bill would help close these dark money avenues to make sure that foreign actors are not exploiting our loopholes to impact our politics and policymaking.
Well, at the moment, we start with that it's illegal for
Good
foreign
reminder.
entities
Important to know,
to
yes.
come in and do that, right? So the problem isn't, do we need to make that illegal? It is illegal. The problem is, we can't catch them at it, and one of the reasons we can't catch them at it is because we have created and maintained these dark money channels. And if it's a dark money channel that can hide the hand of the Koch brothers, or that can hide the hand of ExxonMobil, or that can hide the hand of Big Pharma, then you don't know whose hand it is. And that means it could also be the hand of a Putin oligarch, just as easily. So what's telling in all of this is that our Republican friends are willing to leave that dark money channel open for foreign influence, for Putin oligarch influence, because they're so dependent on those special interests that they don't want to annoy them or discomfort them, even at the cost of our nation's election security.
It's really challenging.
And we saw evidence of that even when the tax bill was jammed through the Congress. And it was really to respond to the demands of the big funders of the Republican campaign. Some of the lobbyists for them even wrote provisions of the bill in the margins. And it's a recognition that they were attempting to reward the folks who principally finance their campaigns very often through these dark money avenues, so we don't even know who they are. And the possibility that there can continue to be foreign interference, that ought to be something you would hope would worry Democrats, Republicans, independents, like whatever your political affiliation, we ought to all agree that the American people ought to decide who its elected officials will be and not a foreign adversary of the United States. But I think the unwillingness of our Republican colleagues to be part of this effort is a sad recognition. As Senator Whitehouse said, that they're very dependent on this dark money to prevail in their elections, and they're willing to endure that risk, which I think is very disappointing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you both have introduced this legislation before, and this time around, you've amended and added a few new things, one of which is stripping policy riders that are actually hidden in the budget bills that are anti-campaign finance. One in particular stops the SEC from finalizing a rule that would require companies to disclose their political spending. Could you talk a little bit about why it was important to put that in this bill and what the problem is with legislating through the appropriations process and how those poison pill policy riders are inappropriate in that space?
Well, first it shows what a policy imperative protecting dark money has been for the Republican leadership in Congress when they have made really extraordinary efforts to jam into must-pass spending bills provisions that prevent the SEC from requiring disclosure of publicly traded companies, prevent requirement of disclosure by big defense contractors as part of the contracting process. They have over and over again gone into the ways in which one might put a little light on the dark money and close them off. So if you really want a regime of transparency that's responsive to regular voters, you've got to reopen those things. It makes absolutely no sense that the Securities and Exchange Commission shouldn't be able to make a rule saying, look, if you're going to be a publicly traded corporation, then we're going to make sure that you aren't messing around with dark money. Among other things, the risk of blowback to shareholders probably makes it reportable. And if you're a ginormous defense contractor, why should it not be a part of our contracting requirements that you have to disclose to whom you're giving money? If you are a ginormous defense contractor, you have a huge incentive to spend dark money to make sure that money keeps flowing back into your company. So these are very reasonable, sensible, natural things that in the ordinary course a democracy would pursue. And the fact that the Republicans have shut them down through these extraordinary hidden spending measures that they buried into must-pass bills is again a red flag about how important this ought to be to the American people to get corrected.
I mean, thinking about, they've taken the position that corporations, public corporations, ought to be able to spend this money without the knowledge of their shareholders or their customers. I mean, that makes no sense. People have a right to know, look, if I'm going to buy this product, I'd like to know the company's going to use some of what it earns to do this or that. I mean, that seems like a fair thing to know, and its shareholders should certainly know. The idea that they're trying to keep that secret, I think, is evidence of how important it is that we shine a light on that process.
And in fact, of course, the Citizens United case, which allowed so much of this new corporate political spending to come in since 2010, actually relied on the idea that all of that money would be 100% transparent to shareholders. And instead, we've seen $900 million in secret political spending since 2010, according to Open Secrets. So we know, what a big problem it's been, and that in fact, they expected to be transparent, and yet it hasn't been. Now, there
are two phony and false premises to the Citizens United decision. One was that the spending was going to be transparent. The other was going to be that it was going to be independent. Now you have these dark money groups being set up that are specific to a single candidate. They actually call them candidate-specific groups. You can't be both independent and candidate-specific. That flunks the test of the dictionary, setting aside legal tests. And yet the Supreme Court has been happy to abide all of this proof of the failure of those fundamental premises of Citizens United. It's really disturbing.
Yeah, so, and we just really appreciate your leadership on taking on, this particular part of that fight. And I think, you've been doing, Senator Whitehouse, a lot of work to shine a light on the influence of the Kochs, beyond even just in elections, but also in policymaking, these rulemakings that we're talking about. I wonder if you could...
Wrote a book about it.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
We got to discuss it. It was
I
wonderful.
today.
Yes, but really capture, the kind of corporate capture of American democracy. Do you want to say a little bit about that effort and how we're seeing the influence of these wealthy special interests and their kind of secretive spending in both elections and then really throughout our whole policymaking government?
The clearest before and after that I lived was on climate change. I was sworn in January of 2007, and all through 2007, all through 2008, all through 2009, we had bipartisan climate bills in the Senate. We had bipartisan climate hearings in the Senate. We had bipartisan climate negotiations in the Senate. And one of our members, Senator McCain, ran for president carrying the Republican banner
That's right.
on a responsible climate platform. So that was what I inhabited when I first got here. From the day Citizens United was decided in January of 2010 until now, no Republican has gotten on a single piece of significant climate legislation. So that's a case where the fossil fuel industry asked the Supreme Court for that decision, anticipated a win, and was ready like a sprinter at the gunshot to go. So from the day of that decision forward, they have been absolutely flatlined on climate legislation. And before then, it was a vibrant conversation, just like you'd expect in a real operating democracy. And afterwards, it's just dead, and it's artificially dead because the gunners of the fossil fuel establishment have gone to the Republicans and said, anybody gets on a bill, you're dead to us, we're taking you out. And they've got congressmen like David's former colleague Bob Inglis as witnesses that they can hang from the lamppost and show, yeah, we took this one out, it's you next if you try that.
Right. Yeah, speaking of Citizens United and the Supreme Court, the news just broke as we were making our way to this meeting today that Justice Kennedy is going to retire. How do you think this will impact the issue of money in politics in general, and more specifically the issue of political transparency with money in politics?
If the Republicans are allowed to appoint this next Supreme Court justice to replace Justice Kennedy, I think that the number one pledge that the nominee will have to make, the number one guarantee that everybody backing him will be insisting on, is that he will protect this dark money operation at all costs. There's a group out fighting on this issue called Issue 1. It's a bipartisan group, and they call it Issue 1 for a reason. If you can control the rules of democracy, which you can through dark money, then you can set it up so that you win on all the other issues, as David said, whether it's pharma or fossil fuel or Wall Street, name your poison. Once you control the machinery, now you can get a win on all of your substantive issues. And that makes it Issue 1 for the big funders of the Republican Party, and that's going to be, I think, the dark story of this next nominee. It will be a dark money nominee.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're all proud to be partners with Issue 1 and
Yep.
cannot,
Indeed, if history is any predictor, dark money was spent to close the seat off to Merrick Garland
Right.
and put Neil Dark Money Gorsuch
Exactly.
onto that seat. Indeed, one contributor gave $17.9 million to that effort. One anonymous donor. Wouldn't you like to know who that was and what they got for
We all
$17.9 million?
Exactly, and what they got. I mean, you know, who is benefiting from when they are distorting the rules so that government is not acting in the interest and benefit of the American people? We've seen all the polling. 96% of Americans think money in politics is one of the is really preventing government from serving people. So we thank you for all of the solutions that you're working on. Sorry, I jumped the queue. I was just
It's
so
a wonderful turning point. We talked a lot about
It's a
doom and
great
gloom.
pivot,
We
yes.
talked a lot about how this is a bad situation that we would certainly like to make better with both the DISCLOSE Act and others. So we talked a little bit about opposition and it changing right around 2010. And so on sort of an uplifting note, thinking about, in addition to the DISCLOSE Act, what we can do and what folks at home who are watching can do to restore the balance to our democracy and tip things back in our favor.
Well, we have a whole package of bills that came out of the Democracy Reform Task Force in the House that really focus on, first, the DISCLOSE Act and campaign finance reform, a number of other initiatives. We also have a suite of bills that relate to protecting the right to vote, reauthorizing, restoring the Voting Rights Act, providing for automatic voter registration, removing obstacles so that we can be certain that the voices of the American people are heard. And I think we have to really encourage everyone who cares about these issues to make sure they participate in our democracy. This election will decide in a very fundamental way whether we will shine a light on what is happening in terms of the finances in our political system, but also whether people will actually be able to vote, whether or not we're going to allow barriers to be constructed, whether or not we're going to allow a court to continue to make it more difficult for people to vote. This is the most basic function of our democracy, ensuring that people have access to the ballot box. And the best way to do that is to remove barriers, make it easier for people to participate, and then create a level playing field so that you don't have this incredible distortion because of the powerful influence of big money in our system. And, there's a reason. I was reading a statistic the other day. When President Kennedy was president, 71% of the American people believed that the federal government was acting in their best interest. Today it's in the single digits. Why? Because the people's understanding of the influence of money and corporate special interests in our system and shining the light on it will do a lot, as Senator Whitehouse always says, to scare the cockroaches away. I think it will discourage most people from doing it, because if people see what's going on, they'll stop participating, which is why the DISCLOSE Act is such an important first step.
Speaking of public opinion, as Liz alluded to, people from across the political spectrum agree that money in politics is a serious problem and that we need policy reforms to address this. What do you think the disconnect is between Republican voters around the country who say they support reforms, electing Republicans that are in fact impeding progress on this issue? Is there a particular disconnect, or how are they winning this messaging war to the point that they're able to get elected by enacting an agenda that's actually very much unpopular with their own constituency?
I think anybody in any race tries to choose what the key agenda points are. So no Republican candidate leads with dark money reform. They will talk about anything before they'll talk about dark money reform. So that leaves it to our side to have to be the ones who bring it up. But the fact that Republican candidates don't want to talk about dark money reform because it will shut down their fundraising and cause consternation in their party doesn't mean that Republicans aren't concerned about dark money. It just means that the candidates who want to play in this dark money world don't want to be outing it. But you can look at Tea Party Republicans, you can look at Country Club Republicans, you can look at Western Republicans, you can go wherever you want. And there's huge, huge bipartisan agreement across this country that big, dark money in politics is an evil, that it is bad for our democracy, and that it's causing regular people to not be heard. And so that gives us some confidence that if we can make this an issue, then that public pressure can begin to mount and we can actually get something done and restore democracy to the people. What we really need is a gentle revolution in this country. Nobody's in favor of violence, but we need a gentle revolution to put the country back in the hands of the people who are the voters. And it's going to take these systemic changes, like getting dark money out, to make that revolution happen gently.
Well said.
And those, yeah.
I think we might have a couple more questions before
Well,
we
just
close
that
out.
those strong, clear anti-corruption solutions, like what you are proposing in this bill, is exactly, we've seen how much people actually want government to be working for them. There was other recent polling that 72% of Americans want government to be working for them and feel like with the right leadership it really could. But so I think that completely agree. If they see these strong, clear anti-corruption and then empowerment solutions, one of the reasons the court has upheld the constitutionality of disclosure is because voters have a right to know, to make that educated vote, for who's going to represent them in self-government. So you guys leading on that, and really thank you for being champions of democracy reform, is really hopefully going to be able to break through so people do see there are people fighting to return democracy to the people.
Yeah.
There are actual steps that can be taken. I saw another poll, I love the data, but like 2/3 of Americans did believe that new money in politics rules could be effective in turning government back to people, which is exactly what was very heartening to me.
Yeah.
So then it's really just moving forward on those
And they're
missions.
absolutely right. They can be effective. They will
Exactly.
be effective.
Yeah.
You'll see a shift almost immediately in political tone.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the rancor and
Dark
the
money is
foul
so
tempers
much
around
goes to negative
politics
ads.
will abate, because there will be less negativity, there'll be more responsiveness, people will behave like their voters mattered, and all of that will bring down people's frustration with government.
And I think you'll see, and you are seeing many, many Democrats that are really leading on this issue, that really folks understand, voters understand that if we don't break this connection between money and politics, we're going to continue to have bad public policy come out of Washington, because it's being driven by very well-financed corporate special interests in this dark money space. People get it. I think 10 or 15 years ago, if you tried to talk about money and politics, people sort of didn't necessarily make the connection between bad public policy, bad outcomes, and the influence of money in our system. People really understand that connection now. And so it shows up at the top of virtually every poll that you do about what do people care about and how do they explain the dysfunction or the non-responsive nature of government, is because of the influence of dark money, big money in our political system that's drowning out the voices of ordinary Americans. People get it, and I think people who refuse to sort of embrace this issue and commit to fixing it are going to do so at their peril, because the American people are onto their game.
Absolutely.
In addition to the 350 million Americans who care deeply about having a responsive and vibrant democracy, there are also billions of people around the world who look to America. You know, we're the city on the hill. We're the power of our example, as Bill Clinton said. And when dark money darkens American democracy, it actually darkens the whole world a little bit.
Yeah.
And it cheapens the leadership and the strength of America around the globe when we're not living up to our own values and living up to our own example. And I can promise you, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, the people who founded this country, if they saw corporations spending unlimited dark money in elections right now, they would think we had
Jefferson
gone
wrote
mad.
against it.
Right.
Yeah.
So true. So one last quick question before we let you get on with your very busy schedules. From your own experience as elected officials and from what you've observed with your colleagues, how has the role of money in politics changed what it means to be a politician?
It has hugely centralized power in the Republican leadership. It's made it much more difficult to be an independent thinker or an independent actor. And in that sense, it has dramatically contributed to tribalism. And you basically have certain areas that you know are no-fly zones for the other party because the interests of their big donors are too implicated. Whether it's climate change or meaningful drug price reduction or Wall Street regulation, you kind of pick your spot. There's now on the issues map areas that are clearly marked no-fly zone for all Republicans or you will be punished. And that's new and unfortunate and very different from when I arrived here just 11 years ago.
And I also think, just as a practical matter, the kind of time that members of Congress and candidates for Congress devote to raising money and talking to donors when they should be talking to their constituents and listening to good policy experts. I mean, that's just a practical implication of a system that is too dependent on the influence of money to get elected. So I think there's just a very practical reason that we need to fix this. And I think if people had a sense of just how much time candidates and members of Congress devoted to this rather than their work, they'd be horrified.
You, on the other hand, are devoting your work to the DISCLOSE Act.
Correct.
So grateful
And
for
your
that.
time to explaining it.
Yes.
So thank you
We
very
very
much.
much appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us and all the folks watching at home. It's very important that people are aware that there are very real solutions and leaders in Congress like yourselves.
And hopefully everyone who learns about this will not vote for someone who's running for office who doesn't commit to fixing our broken democracy and particularly to supporting the DISCLOSE Act. I mean, we have to, in many ways, become single-issue voters on these government reform initiatives if we're going to really fix our country.
Absolutely. So if you're watching at home, be sure to ask your representatives in Congress if they are supporters of the DISCLOSE Act. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rio. Good being with you.
Thank you.
Rachel,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you
Liz,
so much.
thank you so much. Always a
Thanks for
pleasure.
seeing you. Thank you, Senator.
We're gonna head back out.
Yeah.
So we're going to keep rolling. Thanks again
Yeah.
to everyone watching at home. Appreciate you all. Thanks a lot. Take care, y'all. See you later.
Thank you.
All right. So again, appreciate everyone tuning in with us, live streaming, cross-posting across multiple channels. Be sure to share this video. If you're just now tuning in, we just wrapped up a great conversation with Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Cicilline, both from the great state of Rhode Island. They are both outspoken champions in Congress on the issue of money in politics. We were just having a discussion about the DISCLOSE Act, which they are both co-sponsors of. Again, joined by Liz Kennedy with Center for American Progress, Rachel Curley from Public Citizen, I'm Rio Tazwell, People for the American Way. So that was a great conversation. It's so wonderful to meet with elected officials that are so great on this issue.
Yeah.
For the folks at home, let's just debrief a little bit about what the DISCLOSE Act is and what it does and why it's important for our democracy.
Sure.
Go for it, Liz.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Well, I'll just say a couple of quick things I think that we also talked about in the room. Just really requiring more disclosure for the donors behind big money in politics. So if you're spending over $10,000 to impact elections, to convince voters of one way or another, there's no reason why you shouldn't be transparent about the identity of the funders behind that ad. We require it for education and we require it for accountability. I think the specific things here that they are really working against any kind of foreign corporate political spending and closing loopholes against that is critical, as well as Rachel, you discussed so well, removing some of these riders that have prevented agencies from moving forward with necessary rules to require transparency for corporate political spending and open the field to require transparency for government contractors when they spend. So those are critical policy pieces in this legislation that the American people really deserve.
Yeah, and what I was struck by, Senator Whitehouse was talking about this. He was saying, we were asking why are some members of Congress, particularly conservatives in Congress, using the budget process, which is a separate area of legislation that must be passed. Congress has to pass a budget every year, and they're inserting policy provisions secretly, not through the regular sort of amendment process. You can't figure out who has submitted this. Join Congressman Cicilline exiting the office.
Yes, thank you. That's it. We're going to hold there for a moment. Yeah,
all right, we'll keep talking. We can walk and talk.
We'll give him a moment to get back to his very important work. I just was struck by, Senator Whitehouse was talking about how conservatives in Congress are going to great length to hide the efforts to continue to hide secret money. And one of those ways is by inserting poison pill policy riders into the budget. And it doesn't just affect dark money. There's hundreds of poison pill policy riders that showed up in our last budget cycle that affects everything from the environment to gun violence prevention research to any women's reproductive health, all kinds of issues. And so I was struck by that particular point that certain members are going to great lengths to make sure that we don't have this transparency.
I thought, one last thing, I thought another takeaway from the conversation that I was really thrilled about was the impact of what happens in people's lives. Either these policy writers secretly in the bills or this secret political spending and just generally big political spending that means that the policies that people care about because of their families, because of their health care, because of their, because the real wages of American households haven't gone up in 40 years, because of the threat, the catastrophic threat that we face with climate change and all of the storms, the inaction on the issues that matter the most to Americans because of the domination of big money over policies instead of what the American people deserve, which is fair representation. So we need this kind of policy change in the money and politics space so that we can free up elected representatives, bring more champions who are going to work for the American people more effectively. And I think that was something that was really highlighted in the conversation as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's safe to say that people from both parties across the political spectrum are very frustrated, to say the least, with the state of our democracy. People are very aware that it's really not working for the interests of the majority of the people in this country. And it's so important that we let folks know that there actually are concrete solutions like increased disclosure that can go a long way in taking back our democracy from the special interests that, let's face it, have hijacked in many ways the legislative process, the executive branch, even the judiciary now, as we're seeing devastating case after devastating case come out of the Supreme Court as a result of powerful, wealthy special interests that are using their money, essentially, and their influence to subvert the political system to their own benefit. So we've talked a good bit about disclosure and why that's important. What are some other reforms that all of our organizations work every day to promote that folks at home maybe are not aware of?
Yeah, well, one program that has been particularly successful in Seattle is a democracy voucher program. So this is a very cool idea where folks in Seattle get vouchers of $25, they get 4 a year to spend in their local elections. And for folks who don't have a ton of extra income to spend in politics, this is an incredible opportunity to participate in democracy. And there have been testimonials coming out of Seattle where folks have said, this has been so cool. I got to participate in my local election for the first time maybe ever. And so that's one particular reform in addition to disclosure that, again, allows folks to participate in democracy and counters the weight of money from big special interests.
Yeah, the Seattle model is a very exciting form of public financing of elections, essentially giving people the ability to meaningfully participate in the financing of campaigns. Because let's face it, most people don't have 5, 6, 7 figures to drop in support of a candidate.
Or three.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or 2, or anything.
Exactly.
Right.
25
Yeah,
bucks.
yeah. I think that there's also great examples in, for example, New York City and in other systems where they also do citizen-funded elections through these matching funds. So the point is to definitely constrain the anti-democratic power of wealthy special interests, like, for example, banning lobbyist fundraising would be a big start there, and then empower the voices of regular Americans through these kinds of citizen-funded election mechanisms that mean that a family who wants to just give $20 to support somebody for their local city council, to the city council person, that might mean as much as $200. So it really encourages people to look to their own communities to represent their own communities. And I think that a key piece of this is that while we're painting a dismal picture because things are not great, it is really important not to despair about the state of democracy. And I think we do see people saying things can work, and the point of exercises like today, and thank you again so much for tuning in, is to make sure people are aware that there are concrete solutions, there are effective steps that can be taken. And right now, unfortunately, we have seen 92 million people sitting at home, eligible Americans not voting in the presidential elections.
Right.
And worse news, in the 2014 midterm elections, 143 million eligible Americans stayed home, didn't vote at all, didn't have their voice be part of the political decision making. Our exercise, Americans founded representative self-government in this way. Americans need to participate in demanding leaders who will adopt these strong, clear anti-corruption and empowerment solutions.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the importance of disclosure, creating more transparency in political spending. We've talked about the importance of public financing, giving folks a chance to meaningfully participate in the financing of campaigns or run themselves if they don't have rich friends and run in wealthy circles. It's giving a broader demographic of this country a meaningful opportunity to run for office and mount a competitive campaign. I think we'd be remiss if we don't mention a critically important component to the world of campaign finance and money in politics, which is addressing Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United. And for that, we're working to amend the Constitution. Many of our organizations are working to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Supreme Court cases like Citizens United. It's not just Citizens United. Citizens United, which happened in 2010, as I'm sure many folks are aware, was very bad. It gave corporations the ability to essentially spend unlimited amounts of money in political elections. But the problem really goes back to 1976 with Buckley versus Vallejo, which established money as free speech protected under the First Amendment. So one of the many campaigns that our groups and many other groups that we work with are working on is building support for constitutional amendment. We were actually just at a convention this past weekend held by American Promise, where we were talking about all the different efforts that there are to amend the Constitution, and an enormous amount of organizing has happened in just the past few years on this effort. Over 700 towns and cities have passed resolutions supporting a constitutional amendment to overturn Supreme Court cases like Citizens United. 19 states have passed similar resolutions, which is very significant because that's actually half of the number that's needed to ratify an amendment. We need 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states. We're making progress. And it's so important for people at home to be aware that this is happening and that there are great groups like Center for American Progress, like Public Citizen, like People for the American Way, like so many others that are actively working on these and other reforms. So, any other closing thoughts that we want to leave folks with before we sign off for the day?
I think, I was struck by, we talked a lot about doom and gloom. We did talk about sort of the state of things, but I was definitely struck by the optimism of Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Cicilline that folks are now understanding that this is a problem and calling for change. And I think the key, question of does your member of Congress support democracy reforms? Do candidates, running for office support democracy reforms? Those are key questions for folks to ask. And I think folks are asking them. I think in, previous recent elections where candidates have run by saying that they, are not going to take corporate PAC money, that has really has led to successes. And so I think for folks who are watching at home who may have been like, oh man, we've got a lot to tackle, the good news is that we can absolutely tackle it. And I am very excited to see what comes next.
I as well, and I think that really when people think about that American government is too corrupt, I think that we need to be thinking about how do we fight for fair representation. So that's what Americans deserve, free and fair, accessible and secure elections. And then when, after Election Day, money in politics doesn't stop on Election Day, the influence, then starts in representation, we need to be asking, how are you fairly representing me if you're actually taking all of this money, et cetera, et cetera. It's not necessarily about individual bad apples. It's really about the entire system that needs to be restructuring these rules, as Senator Whitehouse, these rules of American democracy, so that we can rebalance power, so that people can achieve responsive and accountable government and really receive that fair representation that I would argue we already have a constitutional First Amendment right. But, if we need to get back to making that point to the court, and we will not stop fighting for an American democracy that actually works of, by, and for the people.
Absolutely, as it should be. Again, want to thank everyone at home for watching. Be sure to share this video with your friends. It's so important for us to raise awareness about the reforms that are being introduced here on Capitol Hill every day. We just know with Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Cicilline, who are co-sponsors of the DISCLOSE Act, one of many pieces of legislation that are being supported and co-sponsored and sponsored. And we're building a movement really every day for these bills here in Washington and all across the country. All too often, I think people throw the baby out with the bathwater and think that all politicians are corrupt and no one's trying to do anything, and they just throw up their hands and people like Donald Trump get elected. We need to remind ourselves that there actually are sensible people in Congress. We just met with a couple of them. There are actually many of them. There are many sensible politicians on the state level and the local level that really want to fix this country and create a democracy that works for all of us. So be sure to check back with us. We'll continue to do these live streams. And thanks again for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.